Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk with Wajahat Ali for the Left Hook Substack, where I invite a subject matter expert who is usually far smarter than me to break down one or more than one big question in 30 minutes or less. And today, I have a superstar. His bio is so long that if I just spend time reading it, it would take like 20 minutes, all right? So I'm going to do the highlights, David. We got Dr. David J. Johns. He's a chief executive officer and executive director of the National Black Justice Collective, a civil rights organization dedicated to the empowerment of Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus, and same gender loving people, including people living with HIV and AIDS. He was first appointed the first executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans by President Obama. He served there from 2013 to 2017, and Time Magazine has just recognized him as one of the closers of 2025. It's a compliment. 25 Black leaders working to end the racial equity gap. From that bio alone, David, or I call you Dr. Johns, you are the biggest threat to the Trump administration. You're working on racial justice, you're working on equity, you're working on promoting African Americans, African American health and education. You're an educator. My God, man. You are, as he says, the enemy from within, and I'm the one who comes from a shithole country, apparently. But no, we're Americans doing our best to promote this country to live up to its professed ideals of equality, of decency, and equity. And the big question I have for you, Dr. Johns, is in this moment where I believe we are facing a fascist ruler, a man who, just as of today's recording, called himself "Long Live the King." A few days ago, quoted Napoleon. How can the rest of us and how can Americans promote racial justice and equity while facing a white supremacist regime? And if that's too hot for you, I'll say the Trump administration.
No, give me all of the heat. We could call them a neo-fascist. I would have said white supremacist, but I'm trying to honor that words matter, and it's often not supremacy. It's a reflection of mediocrity. We can name all of the things. And
I'm here for white mediocrity that is also racist and is attempting to achieve supremacy despite its inherent intellectual inferiority.
well, yeah, and the attempts to preserve unearned privilege are because of the media.
Mm.
Right? If we were actually a country that valued meritocracy, we would all be embracing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and the kinds of competition that coddled, power hoarding, often incredibly privileged white men like the president and his puppet master, Elon Musk, so people don't have to guess who I'm referencing.
I was like, is he going to go Putin or Musk? You went with Musk.
Both are applicable, but at this moment, I'm talking about Tesla guy. But often they benefit from, again, an unearned privilege that they are in this moment attempting to enshrine into law so that they and those who are closest to them can benefit in perpetuity. Before answering the very thoughtful question about how people promote and pursue racial equity and justice in light of these attacks, I want to remind folks I'm reading a number of books. One of them is King of Life by Jonathan Egg, and then another is...
I got it here.
See? I see it right behind you. Oh, no, that's not. That's a different spot.
No, guess what? Guess what? I just read it from the library, and I'm reading just as you're reading. Hitler's First 100 Days.
Right. And so I'm holding this book up, and I want to start here because one of the things that I hope is not lost on anyone, in particular your audience, is that Hitler promised that his Reich, his reign, would last for hundreds of years, and it did not. I don't have the numbers on Napoleon.
1,000. He said, I'm reading the same book you're reading right now. I promise this was not coordinated. Hitler promised 1,000-year Reich, and it lasted 13.
That's exactly right. And Napoleon similarly thought that his reign was going to last forever, and it did not. And so I want people to take umbrage in knowing that these types of dictatorships don't last, and a part of their reign not lasting rather requires us to be in defense of democracy. For folks who have not been introduced to Bell Hooks, I would encourage you to read her words in particular about the fact that we didn't get here by happenstance. We got here because we don't teach. Often we don't teach students, is what she was talking about specifically, but what she says is that we don't often teach folks that democracies have to be defended with each generation. And so I want to start there in responding to your question, and three things come to mind. One is the importance of resisting. So much of what's happening, not just in the People's House that was built by enslaved Africans for free, but in state legislatures across this country. I spent a lot of my time thinking about what's happening or what's happened, what is continuing to happen in Florida, where we are witnessing the tyranny of a failed history teacher turned governor. And I often think about Ronald Dion DeSantis in this moment, but there are ways in which they are asking us as people to capitulate and bow down to them as if they're demigods. And I hope that people understand and appreciate that policies only work when there are people who fuel them. This has everything to do with the president and executive orders and attempting to purge government systems of people who have been servants of the people and understand that that is their job. This has everything to do with educators who have remained in the line of fire. To go back to Bell Hooks, what she says to complete the quote is that we have to remember that democracies have to be defended by each generation, and education is its midwife. So much of why we've seen so many groups, radical right groups, show up in school board meetings and attempting to take over schools and say what books can and cannot be read and what can and cannot be taught and how teachers can or cannot identify, is them knowing the importance of schools and teaching. And my hope is that regardless of what a person in power says, that those of us who do this kind of work, and I'm talking in this moment specifically to educators who do work, we have always the option to resist.
That you said a lot, and I want to unpack it. And asking the follow-up question, I want to remind folks that speaking about Florida, they just got their results. The lowest reading and math scores in 20 years in Florida. Florida, also under DeSantis with the Stop the Woke Act, also scrubbed AP African history classes. We're seeing budget cuts to the Department of Education because it's been a lifelong goal of Republicans post-Brown v. Board of Education to dismantle the public education system, which educates about 90% of American kids. They're going after books, Black history books, Black books, LGBTQ books, to keep people ignorant. Now, as I just said this, I just came back from the Bay Area. My hometown's the Bay Area. I was invited to a fundraiser.
We're both California kids. I'm from Southern California.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So I went there. A lot of the folks voted for Democrats, and I was saddened to see a trend. I went to OKC, saw the same trend in New York, upper middle class, educated folks, children of immigrants. Many of them voted for Democrat, but guess what they said? You know what, though? These liberals, I think they've gone too far. They repeated the talking points of wokeness. They repeated the fake news and disinformation of they're trying to make my kids into trans. And then I spent just 5 minutes. No, seriously, that's what they said. I spent 5 minutes connecting the dots, just 5 minutes. And then I said, they used the Trojan horse of trans. They scared you with misinformation. They spent $200 million. And you, Muslims, people of color, immigrants, South Asians, failed to realize that the same forces that hate trans hate you, in fact, might even hate you more. Yep. That this entire movement is connected. Unpack all of that, Dr. Johns.
Just all of that. I'm looking for a book to reference. So two things and then a connection. I wrote down three things in terms of my response to your question. I got through the first, which is to resist. The second thing is that we should remember things we learned in kindergarten. This is coming from me as a former kindergarten teacher, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. And the third is to be as expansive as we possibly can in doing all that we do to defend democracy. So let's go back to number two. Among the things that we should have learned in kindergarten is that the word equity means fair and impartial. That is at its core what we are talking about, and what the radical right has lulled us into believing as a debate is whether or not as a country we should be fair and impartial.
No, I appreciate that. And you know what? I'm so glad you said that. I was going to ask you to define it after the second question I asked, is because so many people don't know. They don't know what racial equity means.
And often don't think critically about the fact that words have meaning, like to be woke, right? And in this moment, if we can reclaim African ways of being, and for me, a lot of this is the teachings of Black feminists who highlight what they refer to as the matrix of domination, the signs, systems, and symbols that allow white supremacy to be omnipresent yet hyper invisible. Some of that operates in works and words. But the point here for me is that one of the things that I've always thought that we celebrated as a country is being fair and just and right. And before the rise of the MAGA movement, I remember when Joe Wilson yelled, "You lie," and it was the death of decorum in the Senate. Being fair was something that we expected of people who were federally elected officials. Comportment was a word that we would use to talk about the ways in which we expected for them to behave. And in this moment, my hope is that people who especially have children, that they are teaching values that are important for them to imbibe and operate by in this global society, that we can be critical of people in positions of power who demonstrate the exact opposite. Which takes me back to my last point. So much of what is happening in this moment is the weaponization of ignorance and hate. So I sat back and think to myself, and I said it sort of in passing as you were sharing some of these talking points, but if you could teach somebody to be anything, gay people wouldn't exist. In a world where cisgender people don't have to acknowledge that cisgender is a word and it's the opposite of trans, where people who are cisgender don't have to appreciate that their sex assigned at birth is consistent with their identity, right? Like if we could move past the point of people being blinded by their privilege to interrogate some of what we are doing, I don't think that we would be here. And the point for me is this here. If you could teach someone how to be, when we think about the history of this country's teaching people to be straight and love the opposite sex, then we wouldn't be here. That's simply not how it works. And I want people to appreciate this is not a Dr. David Johns thing. Sambufu Some has written a book called The Spirit of Intimacy. In chapter 13 of the book, it's titled Homosexuality to the Gatekeepers. They write, in my village in West Africa, the words lesbian and gay didn't exist, but the word gatekeeper did. Before the term trans existed, people had those experiences. They occupied trans ways of being. And us not calling or naming a people that have existed is not going to stop them from existing. What will is the legislating of genocide.
You know, you mentioned ignorance and hate and how it gets weaponized. And sticking with this, every single person I've asked of the past year who I would call the trans panic has jumped on the trans panic bandwagon. I've asked every single one of them, can you name me one time in your life, personally, where a trans person has ever done anything to you? Said boo in a bathroom, went after your child. Not one time, Dr. Johns. I've been keeping track. This is my own little survey and poll. Not one time have they said, I've been personally affected by a trans person who's less than 1%. And yet, as you know, Republicans spent $200 million on this boogie person, this boogeyman, right? It's in the past, it was Haitian immigrants, it was Muslims, it was Black people. This has been a tried and true strategy of the Southern strategy to divide people of color against each other, right? And how do you get towards racial justice and racial equity when the most marginalized people are actually beating themselves up? And yet again, sadly, we saw it work like gangbusters in 2024.
Sadly, we did, for a number of reasons. So let me state the obvious, which is that we got here in part because of Caitlyn Jenner and the worst parts of white privilege and anxieties and fears of trans people showing up in the way that Caitlyn Jenner singularly continues to show up. And my hope is that we, those of us who are members of sexual minority communities who identify as LGBTQIA+, you will hear me say same gender loving. I don't use gay. Again, words matter. When I say gay, people think white, gay, man. They don't think somebody who looks like me. They don't think the policy issues that matter most to me as a Black man whose policy priorities are consistent with the community and not those of the quote LGBTQIA+ movement. And in this moment, we have to simply acknowledge that. If I were in over your shoulder in some of these conversations, I'd also push you to ask people how many of them are in meaningful relationship with someone who is trans who has invited them in. I don't use the term coming out, in part because it affirms the privilege that straight people have to think that they can stand with their arms folded and expect for us to recite a story about the moment in which we realized we were weird. All of us have a sexual identity and a process for coming into it. And so the question is, do people know, have they developed meaningful relationships with people who will feel safe enough to tell them parts of who they are and how they show up in the world? What I know is that the vast majority of trans people don't live their life as trans. They live their life in the gender in which they identify, unless they are doing the kind of work that requires them to have conversations like this, to talk about what happens when trans men are not accounted for in the kind of legislation that governs one's ability to access life-saving or life-affirming healthcare. Some of this is about policy solutions being pursued without us having the time and space to work through the social education required for people to understand that trans is not a slur, or cis is not a slur. It is simply the opposite of trans. Mm. And you having access to language that names a part of your privilege that you didn't otherwise have to consider doesn't make you less than, it doesn't make somebody more than, but it might allow somebody to have, again, access to life-saving or life-affirming care. The last thing that I'll say about this for me is the vast majority of students across the country identifies anything other than strictly heterosexual. That is not because the LGBTQ agenda is working. The only agenda is for us to be free, to have access to the same rights that other people take for granted. But for me, it's an indication of the fact that our babies who didn't ask to be born, who often don't have the ability to consent to the politics that govern their lives in incredibly intimate ways, but they know that these boxes were not designed to contain us. And so my ask in this moment is for people who don't understand this to appreciate that you shouldn't have to. There are so many different lived experiences in this universe that we're aware of. You should disabuse yourself of the belief that you can understand all of them. You don't need to be understanding to demonstrate empathy. And in this moment when there are so many people, Black trans women go missing and murdered disproportionately compared to any other community of trans folks. The suicide rates for Black youth, regardless of sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression, have doubled over the last 2 decades. Based on the limited data that we have access to, we know that if a student identifies as, or it's often more the case that they are assumed to be queer, because this is about gender performance. This is about students who are not adhering to what we expect a woman, air quotes, to look like or be, or a man, air quotes, to look like or be. For these kids, the suicide rates are astronomical. Depression, anxiety. If we cannot deal with the fact that babies, again, who didn't ask to be born are ringing alarms to no fault of their own, if we can't deal with that problem, then I don't know what problem we can deal with.
And I always tell people, trans people are only 1% of the population, almost like less than 1% of the population. And
that we know of.
Yeah, that we know, but it's not like, you know what, and as you know, it's not just, it's any person that they choose as the bad guy, the boogie person, right? People think Jews are 20% of the population. They're like 1.5%, 2%. Muslims are 30%. Oh, only 1%. You villainize a certain community, and we know this keeps happening again and again and again. It was Japanese Americans, Latinos, undocumented immigrants, Muslims, trans. Next time it'll be something else. The third point that you mentioned about expansion, a big tent. You need resistance, you need education. Specifically speaking about those communities of color that are marginalized, that turn on each other, how would you recommend them in this moment adhering to that concept of expansion, not just for a promotion of racial equity and justice, but also a realization that you being safe, Dr. Johns, and you having rights helps me as a son of Pakistani immigrants. Helping a Muslim also helps the Jew. Helping the woman also helps the undocumented, right? Because we need what I think is a multicultural coalition of the willing to band our powers together like the Avengers to take on the very real threat of white supremacy.
Yeah, I love that, especially after just having watched Black Widow on Disney. We can talk about them and their problematic payout of this administration if you want to as well. So I think in threes, that's the consequence of being the grandson of a Black Baptist preacher. So 3 things come to mind. One, I want to highlight a concept called shared fate. And I want to encourage folks who are interested in this conversation we're having in this point in particular to go to our website, mbjc.org, and look up Black Facts. It's a research study that we commissioned to dig into some of the topics that you and I are talking about. But one of the things that came up in the findings is the importance of shared fate, or this concept or idea that what happens to one member of our community affects another. This is an incredibly strong and salient sentiment in immigrant communities where the stereotypes that might be projected upon one member of the community might affect all members of the community in a particularly pernicious sense, especially if we're talking about accessing housing or healthcare or employment, are the things one needs to participate in our democracy. And so my hope is that in this moment, by us naming, one, the tactics that you mentioned that white neoliberal fascists use, which is to divide and conquer. You don't need to have an overseer if you equipped some of those you are attempting to enslave others, right? The corollary to that, or the opposite of that, for me, is this idea of shared fate and our ability to understand that if we link arms and aims, to use the terms of Susan Taylor, that we can get further faster together. And for folks who are like, what the fuck is he talking about? By sheer mathematical permutations, we do better when we work together. We do better when we work together. And so if we celebrate that, I think that there are opportunities for us to shift. I heard a part of your question being like, what am I saying to other minoritized folks, whether they be Black or Pakistani, or the term is queer. I want to be clear that we've been using queer to reference members of a sexual minority community, but the ontological roots of the word queer refers to those of us who are not in a position of pejorative power. Both you and I, as non-white men, are queer. Black women are queer. People with disabilities are queer, right? And so there are opportunities for us to celebrate queerness and, again, reclaiming parts of words and terms and ways of being that have been bastardized. And so there are opportunities for us as queer folks to do better together. The first step in that is making sure that we all have access to a good therapist. A part of why we end up in the business of oppressing one another and taking on the work of the oppressor is because we haven't dealt with the trauma.
That's so true.
James Baldwin would say that we haven't vomited up whiteness, or the ways in which whiteness or white mediocrity or neo-fascism, whatever the term might be, has trained us to be sometimes just to survive. So much of what NBJC works to disrupt, or at least name, is that often it's the politics of respectability that people hold up as a survival tactic that ends up being used to shame or bully or offend someone else in the name of a panic defense. And so we have opportunities to address that, but it requires us having, first, a good therapist. For a lot of Black folks, I'll name that also includes a good religious or spiritual anchoring to deal with the religious trauma that is in fact named in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health Diagnoses. We no longer name homosexuality as a part of that, but religious trauma is. And so my hope is that people have access to a good therapist. For me, that means that you're required to do work outside of the session. And one of the things at NBJC that I'm most proud of is that over the last 2 years, we provided access for more than 300 Black LGBTQIA plus young people and elders so that they have access to high quality, cultural, competent mental health. That's one. The second thing is, in this moment, those of us who are targets of terrorism, who are at the tip of the spear, I want us most to be concerned with survival. I want people to be busy with the work of accessing the services and communities and practices that give them joy, that allow them to overcome the sustained attacks that are coming our way and that will continue to come. For me, that's most important. And then I think the third thing is that if each of us in our own community lanes can find ways to focus on things that will get us further, faster to freedom, without being as concerned about correcting or quarterbacking the work of our siblings, I think we'll move further, faster along. Too often it's the case that Black leaders in particular are criticized for what we are not doing for other communities, the ways we're not showing up when other people are being attacked in ways that we often know intimately, and that can become a distraction. And so my hope is that there are more of us who are aware of these dynamics that have existed, especially in the lives of Black people since transatlantic and trans-Pacific enslavement, and that people are doing the work of gathering their own so we can all get further or closer to freedom together.
My final question is, the path towards racial equity and justice does not just involve, like you said, minoritized communities. Those of us who have been othered, come from the quote shithole countries, even though we are born and raised here. It also involves white people, or those who consider themselves white. And the question many people have right now is, this guy, Donald Trump, has been president. He's been around for now 10 years. The more racist, the more vulgar, the more ugly, the more misogynistic, the more homophobic, the more his base, which is mostly not exclusively white, many white Christian evangelicals, loves him. You're asking me to do work, to push things forward, to be expansive. That includes white folks. But you know what? I'm done. I'm tapped out. What do we do to those white folks who don't consider themselves to be the problem, who think they're allies, who are the white moderates, or straight up the white MAGA folks who never call themselves racist? Because they also live in this real estate. Do we maneuver around them, go over them, go past them, go under them, try to win them over, try to understand them, go to the Rust Belt diners? In 2025, how do we engage with them on this long journey, but hopefully fruitful journey towards racial equity and justice?
I love the question. And I think we start by asking them a question, which is to do one thing, and it's to prove it.
Mm.
To prove it. I wish that I could take up a collection for every time I found myself saying, especially over the last year, to well-meaning white people, what have you done to advance racial equity today? A part of what so many people missed in the summer of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade, a Black trans man who was murdered by the Tallahassee Police Department around the same time. And people were tripping over themselves, white people in particular, to find resources like Abram Kendi's anti-Black resources. What most people missed, in part because if they read it, they didn't commit to doing the work, is that it requires you being engaged in proactive commitment to equity. It requires you doing something every single day to leverage your privilege to shift things for people that don't have access to your power. And so in this moment, I don't really care about, I want to say anyone, but we're talking about well-meaning white folks in particular who fashion themselves allies because they bought the jersey and put it on themselves and bedazzled it along the way. I want us to remember and appreciate that. I actually am struggling because I hate the word ally for what is done in this regard. It's allowed people to literally think you can go into a store, buy the jersey, and call yourself an ally when active accomplishment is the goal.
Mm.
And so I go back to my last response in the previous intervention, but I'm looking at the white people who are about the business of social justice to gather their kinfolk, to show up at the book clubs and at the Rotary clubs and on the golf course, and to challenge folks who posture, who purport to care and who are failing miserably. I'd cite the CEO of Target, of insert every company that is falling over their sword and tripping over themselves to capitulate at the foot of this demigod, as people who are primed for these kinds of conversations that I, as a Black, same gender loving, free Negro, am not best equipped to have. Now's a time for white folks who care and purport to care to go to work.
Last quick question, because I know there's a good story behind it. Your nails. What's the story? Why do you keep them nicely manicured and colorful?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And so the short of it is that I am an elementary school teacher, and along my journey had a student who was assigned male at birth, who was enamored with nail art, and wanted to at some point paint his nails, but talked himself out of it because he didn't want to be bullied. He didn't want to deal with, again, some of the things that I talked about around expectations of performing, gender identities. And the short of it is that I understood my privilege as a 6'5", incredibly handsome, able-bodied advocate for himself, to say to my student, get your nails done, I'll do it too, and if somebody gives you shit, send them my way. And so it's been a commitment to stand in the gap and to be fabulous while doing so, since that young person helped me to appreciate my power.
It's a great story. Dr. David Johns, thanks so much for joining us. Please shamelessly promote yourself. How can people support you? How can people read you? How can people find you?
Yeah, no, without shame. I appreciate that. Anyone interested in the work of dismantling anti-Blackness, LGBTQIA plus hate, stigma, bias, any of those things, or otherwise defending democracy, can find and support us at nbjc.org. I am at Dr. David Johns across most platforms, but really care in this moment that you find resources that can support you in advancing this work.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining another episode of Chai Talk with Wajahat Lee for the Left Hook Substack. As always, take care of yourself, be kind to each other, and please don't be a fascist.
Please.